What if everything you thought you knew about cheese was completely, spectacularly wrong? What if the creamy, rich, gloriously full-fat brie on your cheese board, the one you guiltily push aside at dinner parties, was actually protecting your brain? What if for over half a century we've been fed a lie? Not out of malice, but out of ignorance, out of fear, out of one man's catastrophically wrong conclusion that reshaped the entire Western diet and quite possibly cost millions of people their memories. Welcome. Let's talk about cheese. Let's talk about cream. Let's talk about Alzheimer's. And let's talk about one of the most quietly revolutionary studies you've probably never heard of. Buckle up. This one is going to flip your fridge upside down. Part 1. The Cheese Guilt Complex. You know the feeling. You're standing in the kitchen. It's late. The fridge door is open, and there it is, that gorgeous wedge of aged Comté, or a thick slice of cheddar, or maybe a ball of creamy, fresh mozzarella sitting in its little pool of brine. And you want it. You really, deeply want it. But then the voice kicks in. That internal nutritional nag that sounds suspiciously like every diet book ever written. That's 30% fat. That's going straight to your waistline. You should eat the low-fat version. You should eat the light version. You should eat nothing and feel virtuous and sad. We've been trained, genuinely conditioned to fear fat, to see full-fat dairy as the enemy, to reach for the reduced fat spread, the skimmed milk, the light cream cheese that tastes vaguely of disappointment and regret. And this conditioning didn't happen by accident. It has a history, a specific, traceable, deeply flawed history. But before we get to that, before we expose the roots of this great fat phobia, let's talk about what's actually at stake here. Because we're not just talking about your waistline, we're talking about your brain. We're talking about dementia. We're talking about Alzheimer's disease. And yes, I promise, we're coming back to the cheese. Part 2. Alzheimer's, dementia, and why your brain is basically made of butter. Alzheimer's disease. You've heard the name. You probably know someone affected by it, or you fear it yourself. It's one of the most dreaded diagnoses of our era, a slow, irreversible erosion of the self, beginning with memory and spreading until the person you knew disappears behind the fog. The word dementia comes from Latin. It literally means without mind, but that framing is misleading, even cruel. People living with Alzheimer's haven't lost their minds. They're losing access to them. They're losing the filing system, the map, the connective tissue of memory and orientation that lets us navigate life. Alzheimer's disease is, at its core, a disorder of protein accumulation. Abnormal proteins, amyloid plaques and tau tangles, build up in the brain. Because they're structurally wrong, the body can't dispose of them efficiently. They accumulate, they interfere, they destroy neural connections, and over time the lights go out, one by one. Then there's vascular dementia, slightly different in origin but similar in consequence. Here, the problem isn't rogue proteins but tiny blood vessels in the brain that become damaged or blocked. Less oxygen reaches the neurons, less nutrition, and those neurons begin to fail. In real clinical practice, the picture is often messier than any textbook. Many patients have what's called mixed dementia, a combination of Alzheimer's pathology and vascular damage happening simultaneously, compounding each other. Now here's the part that should both horrify you and motivate you. We don't have a cure, not even close. We have no medication that reverses Alzheimer's, no drug that reliably halts its progression in a transformative way. The pharmaceutical industry has spent hundreds of billions of dollars chasing a cure, and we are still waiting. What we do have, what research has consistently shown, is that certain lifestyle factors can significantly reduce the risk of developing dementia in the first place. Prevention, not cure. Prevention. We know that regular physical exercise is protective. We know that intellectually stimulating activities help. We know that the Mediterranean diet, rich in olive oil, fish, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, is associated with lower dementia risk. We know that omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, the kind found in oily fish and certain nuts, appear to support brain health in meaningful ways. And here's where it gets fascinating. Here's where the cheese re-enters the conversation. Part 3. The Swedish-Chinese study that should have made front-page news. Somewhere in the corridors of nutritional epidemiology, a team of researchers from China and Sweden decided to do something that sounds simple, but is actually extraordinarily difficult. They followed a large group of people for 20 years and watched what happened. This kind of research is called a prospective cohort study. You identify your population, you gather baseline data, what they eat, how they move, their health markers, their habits, and then you wait. You follow up, year after year, decade after decade. You track who develops what condition, and you look back to see whether their earlier behaviors predicted their outcomes. This particular cohort included 27,000 participants, 27,000 people aged between 45 and 73 at the start of the study, none of whom had any cognitive impairment at baseline. They were tracked for between 19 and 25 years on average. Everything was recorded, every nutrient, every food group, weight, body mass index, lifestyle factors, physical activity levels, social habits, the whole tapestry of a human life compressed into data. And the researchers asked a very specific question. Does the consumption of full-fat dairy, specifically full-fat cheese, at 30 to 35% fat content, and full-fat cream, have any relationship with the subsequent development of dementia? The results were not what the low-fat lobby would have predicted. People who consumed 50 grams or more of full-fat cheese per day, that's roughly a small to medium serving about the size of a matchbox, had a 15% lower risk of developing dementia compared to those who ate little or no full-fat cheese. Read that again. 15% lower risk, not higher, lower. And here's the detail that makes it even more striking. The protective effect appeared to be dose-dependent. The more full-fat cheese consumed, the greater the risk reduction. This isn't a coincidence. This is a pattern, a signal in the data that points in a consistent direction. The same relationship appeared with full-fat cream. People consuming just 5 grams per day of full-fat creme fraiche, barely a teaspoon, also showed a 15% reduction in dementia risk. And the control group? The people eating low-fat cheese, light dairy products, reduced fat alternatives, no protective effect, none. The risk reduction vanished. The allégé, the skimmed, the healthier options, they offered nothing in terms of brain protection. Now, this is observational research. This study doesn't prove causation in the strict experimental sense. But 27,000 people followed for up to 25 years is not a small sample. This is one of the most substantial cohort studies in the field of nutritional epidemiology. The signal here deserves serious attention. Part 4. Why this isn't even surprising. When you understand your brain. Here's something that gets left out of virtually every conversation about low-fat diets, and it's frankly astonishing that it doesn't get mentioned more often. Your brain is fat. Not metaphorically, literally. The human brain is the fattiest organ in the entire body. Approximately 60% of the dry weight of your brain is composed of lipids, fats. 60%. More than half your brain by weight is fat. Why? Because of a structure called myelin. Every neuron in your brain and nervous system has long projections called axons. Think of them as the wires that carry electrical signals from one neuron to the next. These axons are wrapped in a protective, insulating sheath called myelin. And myelin is made predominantly of fat, specifically fatty acids and cholesterol. Without sufficient myelin, neural conduction slows, signals misfire, communication between brain regions deteriorates, and when myelin is damaged, as happens in diseases like multiple sclerosis, the consequences are devastating and neurological. So when someone tells you to cut fat from your diet for brain health, there's a fundamental biological tension there. Your brain needs fat to function. Your neurons are insulated with fat. The very infrastructure of cognition is lipid-based. This doesn't mean you should eat whatever fat you want in unlimited quantities. Nuance matters. The type of fat matters enormously. But the blanket demonization of dietary fat, especially from whole food sources like dairy, was never grounded in solid science. It was grounded in panic. Part 5. The man who scared the world away from fat. Let's go back to the 1950s, post-war America. A country in the middle of a dietary transition. More meat, more processed food, more calorie-dense options than previous generations had ever encountered. And with that transition came a rise in cardiovascular disease. Heart attacks were becoming alarmingly common among middle-aged American men. Into this moment stepped a physiologist, an American researcher, who observed a correlation between fat consumption and heart disease rates across different countries. His hypothesis was bold. Dietary fat, particularly saturated fat, raises blood cholesterol, which causes heart disease. Cut the fat, save the heart. This became known as the diet-heart hypothesis, and it reshaped nutritional science and public health policy for decades. By the 1970s and 80s, governments were issuing dietary guidelines that told people to reduce fat intake and replace those calories with carbohydrates, with sugars and starches. The food industry responded with enthusiasm, flooding supermarkets with low-fat products that were, in many cases, simply high-fat products with the fat removed and sugar added to compensate for the lost flavor and texture. The fat-free era had arrived. And here's the critical irony. Subsequent research, massive meta-analyses, systematic reviews of hundreds of studies, has largely failed to confirm the original hypothesis in its simple form. Saturated fat is not the straightforward villain it was cast as. The relationship between dietary fat, blood cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease is far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more dependent on the overall dietary pattern than early researchers understood. Meanwhile, the shift to high carbohydrate, high sugar diets that was recommended as the healthy alternative may itself have contributed to rising rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic dysfunction. The dietary establishment is slowly, awkwardly, grudgingly correcting course. But the cultural residue, the guilt, the low-fat reflex, the lingering belief that cheese is bad, that's going to take longer to shift. Part 6. What's actually in full-fat cheese? Let's be specific. Let's look at what you're actually getting when you eat full-fat cheese, beyond the fat itself. Full-fat cheese is a nutritional powerhouse that the low-fat narrative has completely obscured. Yes, it contains saturated fat, but it also contains calcium, essential for bone health, nerve function, and muscle contraction. Full-fat dairy is one of the most bioavailable sources of calcium in the human diet. Protein. High-quality, complete protein containing all essential amino acids. Cheese is a concentrated protein source. Vitamin A, a fat-soluble vitamin crucial for vision, immune function, and cellular health. Because it's fat-soluble, it exists in the fat fraction of dairy. Low-fat cheese, much less vitamin A. Vitamin D, also fat-soluble, also concentrated in full-fat dairy. Vitamin D deficiency is epidemic in modern populations and is associated with a staggering range of health problems, including, notably, cognitive decline. Vitamin E, another fat-soluble antioxidant present in the fat fraction. Vitamin B12, essential for neurological function and the formation of red blood cells. Deficiency causes irreversible nerve damage. Short-chain fatty acids, including butyric acid, which feeds the cells lining your gut, supports the gut microbiome, and has anti-inflammatory properties that researchers are increasingly excited about. Iodine, an often overlooked mineral critical for thyroid function and through thyroid function for brain development and cognitive performance. And about lactose, the sugar in milk that many people claim to be intolerant of. Here's the thing about cheese, the lactose is gone. During the cheese-making process, bacteria consume the lactose as part of fermentation. By the time you're eating aged cheese, the lactose content is negligible, trace amounts at most. If you experience gastrointestinal distress after eating cheese, the cause is almost certainly not lactose. Part 7, the liver's dirty secret. Here's something most people don't know, and it's one of the most important facts in nutritional science. If you don't eat enough fat, your liver makes fat anyway. Your body has an absolute requirement for fat, for cell membranes, for hormone synthesis, for brain function, for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. If you don't supply it through your diet, your liver de novo synthesizes fatty acids from whatever substrates are available, typically carbohydrates and proteins. The problem is that hepatic de novo lipogenesis, liver-produced fat, tends to generate particularly unfavorable lipid profiles. The fat your liver makes in response to carbohydrate overload isn't the same as the balanced mixture of fatty acids you'd get from eating real food. And your liver won't warn you. It'll just quietly get on with manufacturing lipids while you congratulate yourself on your virtuous low-fat diet. This is why the simplistic eat less fat advice was always biochemically problematic. You can't just remove fat from the equation without your body compensating. Metabolism doesn't respect simple arithmetic. Part 8, the numbers that matter. Current nutritional science suggests that a healthy diet should derive approximately 35% of its total caloric content from fat. This isn't fringe advice. It's broadly consistent with mainstream dietary guidelines in most evidence-based nutritional frameworks. If you're consuming 2,000 calories per day, that means roughly 700 calories, or about 78 grams, should come from fat. The study we discussed earlier found meaningful brain protective effects at just 50 grams of full-fat cheese per day, or 5 grams of full-fat crème fraîche. These are not large quantities. These are not extreme dietary choices. A standard serving of cheese at lunch, a spoonful of crème fraîche in a sauce, and the protective effect of 15% reduction in dementia risk is not trivial. In public health terms, a 15% risk reduction applied across a population represents an enormous number of prevented cases, an enormous amount of preserved memory, preserved identity, preserved quality of life. Conclusion: stop apologizing for your cheese. So here's where we land. Here's the synthesis. For over 50 years, we've been guided, with the best intentions, but on the basis of flawed and oversimplified science, to fear dietary fat, to choose light over full, to swap cream for nothing and cheese for its pale, reduced fat imitation. And in doing so, we may have deprived ourselves of one of the most nourishing, genuinely protective foods in the human dietary repertoire. The research is not complete. No single study, even one following 27,000 people for 25 years, is the final word on anything. Science is a process, not a verdict. But the convergence of evidence is pointing somewhere interesting, somewhere that the low-fat dogma never anticipated. Full-fat dairy, consumed as part of a balanced, varied diet, does not appear to be the enemy. It may, in fact, be something considerably more complex and considerably more valuable than the diet industry has ever been willing to admit. Your brain is made of fat. Your neurons are insulated with fat. The vitamins your cognitive function depends on are dissolved in fat. And now, a 27,000-person cohort study, followed for a quarter of a century, suggests that eating full-fat cheese and cream is associated with meaningfully lower dementia risk. So the next time you stand in front of that cheese counter, the next time you feel that familiar pang of nutritional guilt as you reach for the Comte, the Camembert, the gloriously unguilty cheddar, remember this: the science may actually be on your side. Eat the cheese, enjoy the cream, and stop listening to a 50-year-old hypothesis that the evidence has been quietly dismantling for decades. Your brain will thank you for it.